All right. Well, so before we start in earnest, let me just say I don't want anyone to miss this important series that we have coming up. So please take a look. We have the short video that's going to play. Please take a look at that. And also, this is a chance you have to get your pencils out to make sure you can get this information down so you can get all these resources. These are going to help to answer all kinds of questions that we really, we're just not going to have time to get to answer here. So.
What does physics have to do with the truth?
Physics is the study of the physical world, and the truths of the physical world are the first truth we need to get to any other truth.
Dr. Rizzi brings his expertise as a physicist and as a good Thomist.
I chose to be involved in this series because without this, our culture will continue to fail, and good people are starving for it and they need it. This show is going to bring you things you've never heard before. It's going to change the way your family lives and the way you live.
Join me as I have a conversation with the author of The Science Before Science, a guide to thinking in the 21st century, Dr. Anthony Rizzi, who will make the case for truth.
Our culture is in need of radical reform at the base, and you, by watching, will be part of that reform.
In the meantime, get your copies of these resources today. You can get Dr. Rizzi's Kids Introduction to Physics and Beyond that gives the essential foundation that you need for all your thinking at the iapweb.org site shown. Also, you will need Dr. Rizzi's The Science Before Science, which goes beyond the kids' book and explains the basics of life. It is available as an audiobook.
All right. So everybody, to remember, mark your calendars for next week. That's next Monday, April 19th at 8 p.m. Central. So I see we have a few people typing in the live chat. So please go ahead, start typing your questions there. We really want to get in as many questions as we possibly can in the time that we have. So please start getting them in there. Just the first one, Dr. Rizzi, I wanted to get out. I know you said in the podcast that America is a principle-based country. So can you just speak a little bit more? What does that mean? Can you fill that in some?
Yeah. So principle, it's a hard thing because today we don't really think according to principle. We think according to what we've been sort of programmed to do and not do. So it's hard for us to go back to first principles and do things like, well, I see that's true, therefore I should do this behavior. And that's the way the founders thought. They understood the world and they understood our nature, and they understood that you start with what you, at some level, that you start with what you see, which isn't people. You see bodies, but you don't see the souls of people. You don't know that they have an intellect and a will until you figure it out. So you have to figure out through your senses that, hey, I'm a person. I have an intellect. I have a will. You have to figure that out about other people. And then you start having to figure out how you make people work together, because you see that because you have an intellect, you have a ordination to truth that you're made to know. And so then you need other people to do that, because you can't figure almost anything out by yourself. Without your parents, you'd be dead. So you need other people. You need to work together. You need to have a society. And they had, through the centuries, as we talked about in the podcast, people figured this out. And we had St. Thomas Aquinas sort of summarize the sort of type of government that he thought was the ideal type of government that was really at that point already, starting to be formed. But St. Thomas wrote it down and it sort of transmitted into the depths of culture and got transmitted to them. And they knew this, and they said, look, let's make a country where we notice that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights because of their nature. And that we're one nation under God, because that's our final common good. That's a good that we all share. That's all a common good is. It doesn't mean the collective thing that the communist means. It means we have a common good, a shared good, which the highest one is God, and that we're oriented towards that. And so you have to have a principle. So you look at the world around you and you figure out, okay, what kind of government works best? And that's what they absorbed, the thinking and the understanding of the past, and came up with this country, which is what the Constitution expresses. as I said before, Lincoln pointed out that the Declaration is the basis of our country, and the Declaration points back to the natural law, which is what I just described, starting from what you see, concluding to your own nature, concluding to the way you have to interact with men to be reasonable, and to be reasonable, to have an ordering because you're incomplete and you don't have the truth that you need, to ordering finally to truth himself. And they sat down and they wrote the Constitution, which came out of that. And the Constitution is only 4 pages. It's kind of startling when you go to the Washington, D.C. and you look, there's just 4 pages. That's the American government. And that's because back behind it, there's all these principles. And when you have a general principle, you can deduce things to do and things not to do. And that's so like an example of a principle, and principles by nature have to be true. Now you can distort a principle and make it false, but we're talking about true principles. So if I have the true principle that if I add up all the angles to a triangle, that it'll be 180, then I know that's true for every triangle that I meet. I don't have to say, well, that triangle is a red triangle and it's not going to be. I know that, and I can deduce something about the way I treat triangles from that. I got to treat them different than squares or, octahedrons or whatever. And then I use that principle. And I find that because we are so bereft of thinking that Americans aren't supposed to be that, Americans have not been like that. But because of the problem that we're facing, and it's a severe problem, we don't think like that. And that's what it means to be principle-based. Is you got these general things that you see and you specify them, and then you behave according to what they have you behave. And so when you see evil, you stomp it out because you see that it's out of order and it's going to hurt people.
Oh wow!
I can talk more on that if you think it would be helpful, but
yeah, no, that's really good. It's tough. We got there's so much to discuss. So
it's a lot to say.
Yeah, but that's a really good exposition there, bringing that out, the depths of what it means to be a principle-based country. So thank you for that. I have a question from Ryan, which is kind of related to the principle-based, kind of, what principles are there. He's asking, was there any Enlightenment influence in the founding of America? And he's pointing to there's these writings of Thomas Jefferson, his Life and Morals of Jesus, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense. He says it seems to make him think there are those influences.
Yes, so that's what we tried to talk about earlier. It's a very good question. Thank you for that question, Ryan. The Enlightenment, is a confused idea because it really doesn't, insofar as it's good, it's coming out of an already existing Western tradition, a growing Western tradition. It's not something new. The idea that the laws of nature are there is a medieval idea. The idea of government, if you've seen, are medieval ideas. They date back way back before the so-called Enlightenment. But what's happening with so I'd rather call it scientism, because there's 2 parts of the Enlightenment, if you will, and that's just the natural growth of the understanding of Western culture that's deeply grown by Christianity and by Christians. And then there's the part of the science that was misdigested, that good and great modern scientific method that also grew positive things as well. But because it was misunderstood, it started twisting everything. And you see that happening in the French Revolution. But it's true that the founders were affected by this thinking, but it didn't reach the essence of what they were talking about. And a lot of what you think is like some of this twisting is actually them coming out of a more clear understanding of what was already built into Catholic Western tradition. But it is true that some of the founders had trouble with revelation and they would bounce around. Jefferson might be, Thomas Paine, a lot of people had trouble considering him a founder because of his tendency, later tendencies of anti-Christianity. In fact, most of the founders pushed him out because of his later tendencies of anti-Christian sentiments. But none of the other, so you wouldn't really, so Paine is kind of ambiguous because at the beginning he starts out the same as the rest of the founders. But Thomas Jefferson is always aware of the deep and deeply respectful of this tradition. You know, he puts his, to show you how deeply respected he is, he puts his daughter in a Catholic school in France to raise her. He does have trouble, probably the most of any founding father, with revelation, and understanding revelation. But there's a whole set of things that become before revelation that revelation presupposes. And this is the natural law I've been speaking of, the things you can know directly that that are brought to fruition by an understanding of revelation. And so he struggled with some of that stuff. And I would say of the actual founding fathers, he's probably struggled the most with that. And so he did things that in his private life mostly that went a different direction as he struggled with this. But in his public life, his high respect for Christianity was evident in most of the things he did, and especially the things that he said. And we have to go back and look at like his Thanksgiving Day proclamation in Virginia that he did, that called for fasting, prayer, and just a general recognition that we have to go back to God, and that Christianity is the vehicle, that the best vehicle. So, you know, the infection was happening, and we're now deep in the infection. The infection has grown, and the point here is to remember that those men had the infection much less than us at that foundational part. Sort of the way they actually fought on the ground is so much better than us. And even if we have that revelation better than them, they have that foundation. You know, they're sort of the naturals, if you will. That they're the athletic equivalent. The athletic equivalent would be someone who's just born being able to play baseball. Like the movie The Natural, the guy just can hit the ball, he can pitch, he can do everything. And that's kind of how these guys are. Now some of them fail in varying degrees to be able to take it to the next level. But this is the Enlightenment, false side of the Enlightenment that's kind of messing with them. And that's discussed in my What is America article.
Oh yeah, and by the way, I have a copy of that here. So you can get this if you go to the IAPweb.org website. You can go to the magazine, find the article, and we encourage you. Once you've read it, please send us your questions and thoughts on it. Yeah. And that's actually related. That we have a question from Michael, who's asking for us to point him to good resources to help better understand our heritage as Americans, but he also asked, is such study worthwhile and where we should start? So it seems like this will help him.
Yeah, the What is America? It's obviously, that's why I wrote the article, because it really doesn't, the explanation and the depth, to really understanding America hasn't really been written before, because you have to understand the physics, by which I simply mean that which you get through your senses and the starting point of all of our knowledge, to really understand the founders and really understand the principles at the basis of our principle-based country. So it's worthwhile, because this is where we are, and this is where we've grown, and you have to take the good of where you are and grow from that. And that's the only way you can understand the environment which you're in, and not only keep what's good, but protect from the error. And there's, as you see, everyone should be aware by now that there's something seriously wrong with our country right now. And everyone should be afraid of it. Everybody should be deathly afraid. For the last 55 years, the country has been in a sharp decline against our own principles. And there's been very few that have even recognized the radical shift away from American principles. Somebody might say it in this corner or this corner, but to see that the attack at the core, when you attack the heart of a man, you kill him. And if you just notice there's a wound over here and there's a wound over here, you don't get it. Wait a second, it's not pumping any blood.
Yeah.
So you have to look for the causal structure, and that's what we've been missing over the last 55 years. There was a direct hit in the 60s, a principled hit. It wasn't in the culture yet, but a principled hit to the thinking that has gradually moved further and further down the road, to the point now where we have people debating the House actually has this bill that says that they want to wipe out all the he's and she's and references to father and mother from the government documents, some subset at least of the government documents. And it's just, these kind of things show a lack of understanding of nature that just the founders would be miffed at, and would make, frankly speaking, would make all the machinations of the American government pointless, because they're all based on the natural law. The whole government is based on the natural law. An analogy I like to make is, if you're gonna read the Bible, you can't just read the Bible, because you go to a Bible and first of all you have to learn the language, English or French or whatever language it's written in, which you can't get from it. And you're gonna have to know what a man is, a rock is, what a physical thing is. You have to know, what a lamb is, what a lion is, and you don't get that from the book. So that's the whole natural law. The whole natural law. That's the whole thing that Christianity is about, and the founders knew, is it's about, growing us in truth, starting at the beginning, not at the end. And so if you don't have the foundation right, how can you get what comes later right? Which is revelation, and things that build upon it, build upon what you know through your senses, what you know already. I can't tell anybody something about anything, and they can't tell me about anything unless I already know some stuff from what I saw.
Yeah.
So this really important, it's hugely important for those reasons to reclaim our American heritage. And that the first step in that is knowing what it is. There's very few people not knowing the physics, which is the core problem of our culture, not knowing the physics, not knowing the starting point, because we have been all taught based on an equation alone physics that teaches us principles in a twisted way. And that hit in the 60s big time. And that's why we keep, these battles keep getting further and further lost. If you look at the sweep of history, it's this direction towards a more and more scientized world, towards what Huxley called the Brave New World.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's huge. Okay. Well, yeah, I think that brings the point home about the importance of going back to this stuff, figuring it out. This is an interesting question from Benjamin. Has to do with these principles that are in the founding documents. He's asking, what's the relationship between the freedom of speech that's discussed in the First Amendment and truth? And do we have the right to say anything regardless of whether it's true?
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good point, because the one thing I should say is that the founders were so convinced of the natural law from their English upbringing in the deep Western Catholic civilization that they were just imbued with, that they were afraid of making those amendments, including the First Amendment. And the reason is because they were afraid that people would just say that's all there is what's written down there, which is what the scientism tends to do, which is what that false enlightenment, the unenlightenment, I can call it, that people refer to, which they don't understand, comes from a misunderstanding of the scientific method that you can learn about in the kids' introduction to physics. That they were afraid that, they just say that's all the rights you have is what we listed here. So they resisted pretty heavily putting any of the rights down, and because they didn't want this to substitute for the natural law, because of that deep understanding that there's a bunch of stuff out there that you can see. It's a source of information. The world is a constant source of information that keeps growing our understanding if we let it. And anything we write down is going to be stuck there. And besides that, even what I know now, I can't write it all down. It'd just be pointless. So but they didn't want to lose certain key points. So the First Amendment, the point of the First Amendment was to make sure that people could argue with each other. It was a truth-oriented amendment, because in coming to the decision to have the revolution, they wanted to make sure they were right, that they were doing the right thing and in the right way. And they had big debates about finally, like the Declaration. Initially, the Declaration had a lot more stuff in it that was like really a lot of animosity toward the British that they took out because they wanted to be clear and true.
I see.
So the First Amendment was never about say whatever you want. It was about, and that goes back to the bigger picture of American principles, that liberty, what does liberty mean? It doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. It means you have the right to do what's true and what's right. And Lincoln says you have no right to do what is wrong. There is no right to do what is wrong. And then there's the whole issue of how you play out the federal government's role, the state government role, the county government role, and that's the so-called principle of subsidiarity, that the most specific rights belong to the lowest level of organization, which would be the family and the individual. And then they get more general rights. And so the government has less and less right to take specific things. As I say in my article, there's no right for the federal government to tell you when you brush your teeth. That's your mother's job. And so you have to look at the ordering, but the general point is to preserve this right to argue. And you're never expected to just say whatever you want, because you're supposed to want to grow in virtue. All the founding fathers thought of the purpose of government and the purpose of life was to grow in truth, which is what virtue is, to grow, what they would say is grow in virtue. And virtue is nothing but living the truth till it's habituated in you. Living the truth till it's habituated in you. So virtue was paramount. Washington was at pains to make sure his troops understood this. And he did so well over the, like in the course of the war in 1776, he grew with his troops, and he was trying to, at the end of 1776, the conscription was up for like 2,000 or some thousands number of his men. And they were going to leave. And basically when he just was ready to cross the Delaware and have the Battle of Princeton, and the British were just coming on him. And so he went up to them and he said, we can give you $20 or some amount of money if you stay. And it was apparently a pretty big amount of money, especially compared to what they were getting. And none of the men stepped forward to stay. But when he made the virtue argument, he had been so successful and the men had been so successfully imbued. When he made the virtue argument, this may be the only time in your entire life that you can do this for your country. All of them started stepping forward, and he got them to stay by reminding of them this is an opportunity to defend and grow in virtue for your country. So it was all about that. It was about, growing in the understanding, and that you expect your citizenry to say responsible things. And if they say irresponsible things, the court has rightly, in the past, ruled that you don't have a right to say things like, there's a fire when there's no fire. In fact, you go to jail for that. So you don't have a right to say whatever you want. You have the right to say what's true. And there's varying levels of consequences for not. Your mother is the first level of consequences. And but there has to be consequences, and you can't go around saying I have a right to say whatever I want to say. You have to say what's reasonable to say, and you have to, virtuous growing people, we want to hear reason. We want to hear if we're wrong. We say things wrong, and we don't want to be just shut up. We want to have explained and argued with us, and that's the point of the First Amendment.
Wow, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you for that. We have a question coming from Judy, and she's asking, she points out, unlike the Supreme Court decision that was banned polygamy, now we have so many anti-nature decisions coming out of the court. So why are the modern, even constitutional judges' interpretations off-based?
Oh, thank you for that, Judy. That's a really good question. And the answer is because of the scientism, because of this false enlightenment, the very enlightenment that they claim founded the country, that is destroying the country. The Enlightenment didn't found the country, not what people mean by the Enlightenment. This Western civilization principles formed the country. but this thing really hit in the 60s and replaced an understanding of nature with a rule-based understanding. So you get judges like Justice Scalia, who, does a lot of good things that actually ends up being natural law. But his theory is that you just have to treat the Constitution and the legal history as if it were simply a bunch of rules to be followed, and you just ignore the natural law, which is exactly the scientism. It's exactly the opposite of American principles. But people started accepting that because it seems to a way to stop the stop the flood. So it does sort of locally seem to slow things down. So people seem to think, but if you look at it globally, what it's done is just what you've described, Judy. It's gotten worse and worse and worse because the courts keep looking for, these kind of things on the one side, little rules to stop what they don't want to happen, or rules that they think that were in the Constitution or written down somewhere, exactly the opposite of what the founders wanted. Or on the other side, well, you make up things because you don't really understand the natural law, but you think that certain injustices are happening, so you just assert them, and you think the Constitution is about nothing, or you get confused and you think it's part of the natural law and you don't say it. It's a lot of confusion that happens. So that's what ends up going on, is you end up losing your standing ground, and you can't defend the principles anymore because people don't have the physics, and so they go back to just try to look at the rules. But when you're, like I said before about the Bible, unless you have the principles, when you read the rules, you don't understand what they mean. Yeah. You take the First Amendment to mean that I can say whatever I want. You take this other amendment to mean something totally random that could never be a meaning that's true. And so you end up getting an increasing number of anti-natural decisions that create a new system that is ungrounded anywhere and moves away from American thinking. And American thinking is grounded in the earth. It's not just a set of things that some guy made up and said, look, we want these rules to general rules that have no particular meaning right now, and they're just going to blossom into whatever we want. That's the system thinking. That's the equation alone thinking that somehow or other a system of symbols, you can just create them and that's the world. And you don't really have an obligation because you don't really think there's any connection to the ground. So does that, Judy, I'd like if you could put in the chat if that answers your question.
Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah, that's a very helpful example of how some judges can even be doing things that kind of locally, like you said, locally have a good effect, but then overall are just sort of pushing us further down.
Short term, it stops one thing and everyone gets happy, and then later on it becomes a vehicle by which you get rid of everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. Man. Well, I will let you know if Judy responds in the chat. In the meantime, there is another question. This one's from Michael. He says that politics often comes up in conversations in our day-to-day lives. So how do we approach people who are doing great damage to the country through ignorance or even malice?
Well, I mean, so it depends. Like if they're a friend of yours, it's a great thing to engage them in conversation and discussion, and just say, why do you think that? And listen. I mean, we don't do enough listening to each other. So listen to see what they actually think, and give them the benefit of the doubt that they might think something different than what you think they think. And then, try to think about what they said and try to answer what they said in light of what you learned about the principles. But the first thing you're going to have to do is learn the principles yourself to have a good base to do that. We really don't have a good base to do that. We don't have the Kid's Introduction to Physics is a simple book. It's written like, I've been able to teach it to like 3-year-olds. I can't read it, but I can teach it to them. And so simple stuff. It's simple stuff, but it's not stuff we know. And until you know that stuff, you can't really answer those people. And that's the first thing we have to realize, is that we are the problem. And so when we try to answer them, we give them answers that actually are illogical, in the sense that the false construct that they've made, we share it. So we answer within that construct. And within that construct, they're right. So this is the problem, is that we're dealing with our own ignorance. And then, the malice, the best thing you can do with the malice is to try and just engage, make a hook for a reason, to have a discussion. And, interesting things interest people, and they'll forget their malice for a little bit. And, but some people you just won't be able to reach like that, and you'll have to leave to somebody else. But that brings me to the other, another one of the American, incarnation of Western tradition, Johnny Appleseed. He went around talking about the gospel and planting apple seeds. And so throughout some portion of the Midwest, you have all these apple orchards. And so that's what you can do. You can plant seeds. But to plant the seeds, you got to get the seeds. So that's why I encourage you, get the What is America article, get the Kids Introduction to Physics, get the audiobook for the Science Before Science, all the things, get yourself involved in a study group, learn the stuff so you can begin to have the conversation with them.
Yeah, that's really important. I hope everyone can really take that to heart after this Q&A and podcast is over. Judy did respond, by the way, and she said that was great, and thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Judy. Thanks for answering. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So I have a question here from Stephen. He's asking, am I correct that this scientism is not just a problem of the left or the right, but for everybody?
Yes, that's right. It's every single individual, including myself. It's a whole process of working yourself back to the ground. It's why the founding fathers can be inspirational and should be inspirational to us. If you see the way they lived and acted, it'll make you go, why'd they do that? How'd they do that? Because it's so much more spontaneous in them than it is us, because we've been raised in this other way. But we still have it. Americans still have something of the American spirit, but it's nothing like what they had. And it's been boiled out by this scientism. And all of us, can't help but drink the milk we were raised on. So it affects us. So, like, to go back to Justice Scalia, I believe that he wanted to be a really good man and tried to be a really good man. He just digested this view of the law, which was based on rules instead of nature. Mm-hmm. And so he got trapped, as we all get trapped, and he couldn't, answer questions in a rooted way, in a truly American way, to be honest. It sounds odd because he would not have liked that himself, but that's that's true of all of us, is that we don't understand the way we've been formed and the need to get ourselves reformed. And so we end up acting as instruments to the very thing we're trying to fight. And that's why I say we got to go back and get those principles to even understand ourselves, but then also to understand our country and to save our heritage. Because as I said earlier, it really is, if the United States doesn't turn around, the Western civilization has no hope, no hope left. Because the only place that this Western civilization still has a strong foothold is the United States, because of her principled founding. I'm going to repeat that, because of her principled founding. Mm. And because of the age of this country. As defined by her government, this is by far the oldest country. It gives us a hook back to when the scientism was much less strong and the natural law was much more part of people's thinking and feeling. And it really has to be in your feeling, and you really have to feel this to be able to do it, to make something different happen. And you have to, say, you have to do what Washington, I'm calling everybody to do what Washington had his troops do. This is your chance to defend your country. I can't offer you money, but I can offer you this chance to defend your country. And the way you do it is by educating yourself and spending the time, and then engaging other people, talking to other people, forming study groups, ask what is America, and really want to know, get the principles yourself, and then bring them to bear to bring back the principles of America in your own life, and ask for our politicians to do it by forming, your own objections and so forth in a clear way. And like I say, the way to do that is to go get, you can't do this in the air. You have to go back to the ground, reestablish based on what you see. And that's the kids' introduction to physics, the science before science. But I do want to call people to really, get that feeling in their gut when they see what's happening to our country, and make a commitment to first change ourselves, and then realize if we don't, we're like those guys that didn't stay with Washington. And they didn't realize what history was in the line. Washington did, but they didn't realize what happened. Can you imagine if those men had left? They had had one victory. If those men had left, that would have probably been it for the American cause. There would be no America, and we would probably be Nazis or Stalinists or something worse. The good influence of America would disappear from the earth, and that's what you're being called to consider right now.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty heavy, but really important.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Dr. Z, I think unfortunately we're out of time.
Yes. It goes fast.
Yeah, it really does. But I do, thank you all for tuning in and joining us. I want to encourage everyone, like I've said before, please go to iapweb.org. There's lots of interesting stuff there. Don't forget to email us, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and look here for more to come. And especially stay tuned for Decision for Truth. That, as I said, and as you saw, is coming up next Monday, April 19th at 8 p.m. Central. So look forward to seeing everyone there. There's going to be 5 episodes, one each night, Monday through Friday next week. So really hope you can join us for that. So thank you so much, Dr. Rizzi. I look forward to doing another podcast with you at some point.
Yeah, be great. Be good.